Okay, so we're with Matthew Ehret, editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot. We have different questions that we want to ask him about the related to the latest event that occurred in Quebec, in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, and in Ottawa, and how it actually relates on a global scale to the events we've been seeing for many years, the escalation. How does it relate to that? So the first question is, you have these two events which occurred recently last week, 2 days apart. We have had a growing police state being created since 9/11 in the United States, of course. How do you see the events for Canada? What does it entail for the future in Canada? Can you say a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, as most of the audience here watching will have known by now, that there's been two so-called terrorist incidents which have occurred this past week. The first being that hitting of the officer that occurred in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu on I believe it was the 18th or the 16th of October. And then more recently on the 23rd, we've had the shooting in Ottawa. In both cases, what I think is important to recognize is not what has been said about lone Muslim gunmen acting out against the society that doesn't understand them or something like that, but that there has been, like you said, an increasing post-9/11 police state apparatus that has been forming both in the United States and also in Canada. And there's something very important for people to recognize, is that since Harper has introduced himself or been installed as the Prime Minister of Canada back in 2007, there's been a massive amount of acceleration of the surveillance state, police state apparatus, where people often forget that just after the the Boston bombings last year in 2013, I think it was April. Just after that event, we had a via rail terrorist plot that was subverted, and within a day of that so-called subversion of that terrorist plot that didn't go through, not many details were released to the public, but within a day after that occurred, what you had was Bill S7 that was introduced in the Parliament and passed, which allowed for the preemptive detainment of Canadian citizens on suspected charges of terrorism. For up to 3 days, no charges had to be laid, no habeas corpus, no nothing. And if anybody chose not to testify in court for any reason, on whatever charge that they were, or whatever claim that they were, was being laid upon them, they could be held for up to 12 months with no charge. And this was something which was a complete break of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and happened almost as though when people were asleep and just in a state of fear and confusion, because this was all over the media. And this is exactly what has occurred now in the context of these last two terrorist attacks on Canadian soil. Harper, this is all of 8 days ago, introduced a bill. I forget the name. I don't think the bill has actually received a name yet, but it is about to be voted up, which both integrates Canada, especially CSIS, more deeply into the Five Eyes: Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Great Britain. So the Five Eyes security apparatus that Edward Snowden revealed in great detail, how this thing operates internationally. This will integrate Canada ever more deeply. It will expand CSIS's powers, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. It will expand their powers to utilize secret evidence from sources that are secret, informants, moles, whose names will never need to be revealed in court against anybody who's prosecuted or accused of conducting anything which is against the interest of the state, and are labeled so-called terrorists, which even that, as Edward Snowden and Glenn Greenwald have made the point, are terms that are very much underdefined what terrorism is. I mean, this can be very easily and loosely interpreted in many ways, which makes it very dangerous. But now even the judges, the lawyers in those cases will not be allowed to know the names or the
nature of the allegations. Where does it come from?
No.
What proofs?
No, exactly. And so these are completely unprecedented in Canadian history, and I don't think that these things would go through if things that I think we have reason to believe are false flags, such as these terrorist operations, had not occurred.
You know, how
So I think that
did these things basically come to be? Of course, we know about the RCMP. You know, different events occurred in the past. One would remember the October in the 70s when when the soldiers were basically sent in the street to
Martial law.
stop the martial law was imposed in Quebec and Montreal especially to stop the FLQ. Now, so that's the RCMP and the military. What is CSIS? How did where does it come from? And
Okay.
what's the background?
Sure. Well, it's good that you went as far back as you did, back to the October crisis, because to understand what CSIS is, you really do have to go back that far, and you have to recognize that the utilization and creation of terrorist groups, anarchist groups within Canadian soil has been something which is a sad part of our governance structures, which does. It really kicks off throughout the period of the 60s. And in the 60s, what did you have? You had a great period of potential. You had John F. Kennedy's programs up until 1963, until his assassination, inspiring people around the world to think about the future, to actually engage in Roosevelt, Lincoln-style nation-building strategies, which were aimed directly at eliminating poverty, at applying the best technologies that we have for developing and problem-solving the world over, right? And getting rid of colonialism and all of its evil traditions from the British Empire and helping these countries develop in a modern way. And that was the dream. That was where we were going. And people, if you look at the Canadian context, we had people like C.D. Howe, who was on that path towards a real nation-building strategy. You had people after him who were perhaps his political enemies, but nonetheless had a similar view towards applying the best of what we've got, like John Diefenbaker, who did have a view at developing a real nation, a sovereign Canada, that was going out and helping poor countries uplift themselves into the 21st century. And all of this was gripping the imaginations of young people. So what overthrew this cultural dynamic of optimism? Well, you got to look at the 60s. The 60s was a real social engineering experiment, which a lot of people have not fully internalized what happened. Because after JFK died, it wasn't just that everything went sour magically. There was a huge onslaught into the population, especially those baby boomers who were born after World War II, who were submitted to a whole new strategy of warfare in Vietnam, friends coming back in body bags for a war that nobody understood. You had LSD spread all throughout the campuses of McGill, of Harvard, of Yale, all across Europe, of sex, drugs, rock and roll, forget the future, forget the past. The whole new ethic became live for the now. Live for your hedonistic impulses, just be, right? So the environment of terror, people often forget, had really been put in place throughout the 60s in Quebec through the method of using things like the FLQ, the Front Libération de Québec, which was a radical, anarchistic terrorist group, which made a name for itself by setting up bombs in mailboxes throughout the entirety of the 1960s. Many people were injured. We had deaths. This was largely also, to point out the Quebec context, allies of John F. Kennedy, like Daniel Johnson, our great premier, the father, not the son, who was allies of de Gaulle, were also leading with people like Jean Lesage at applying this nation-building strategy at creating a real dynamic future of progress and science in Quebec that was gripping, again, the imaginations of young Quebecois to think about the future. This is what was really under attack, was this sense of the idea that the future could be a great place if we build it, if we always go to what's better. So when all of these bombs are going off, the FLQ was spreading. Le Devoir in Le Journal de Montréal, at that time, I guess they had a little bit more liberty of expression than they do these days, actually ran a series of articles throughout that entire period, even into the 1970s, revealing different controversies that had surfaced of RCMP officers being caught red-handed spray painting FLQ logos in government buildings, and so much more. And throughout the 60s, it's really important to look at how the RCMP, or a special branch within the RCMP, not every RCMP officer, by no means am I saying this, but you did have a special department within the RCMP that served a function of organizing internal chaos operations, especially things like the FLQ. Extortion, I mean, you can literally just go online and you can even do a Wikipedia search, and this stuff is not hidden. This is even available on something like that. The RCMP had such a list of controversy that they built up for themselves by for the theft of explosives from RCMP ammunition depots, extortion, bribery, the most dirty acts imaginable that they were caught for, and this was reported upon, were brought to the public attention. This, as you mentioned, culminated in the case of the 1970s in October with Pierre Elliott Trudeau declaring martial law. This shut down the Bill of Rights throughout not just Quebec but all of Canada. It was entirely cancelled during this period that involved the assassination of Pierre Laporte, one of the allies at that time of Jean Lesage, and the kidnapping of a British diplomat who was later on released. The level of scandals that had built up continuing throughout the 70s resulted in such a situation that this division within the RCMP became not very useful for the British Empire. And when I say the British Empire, what I'm talking about is the financial oligarchy, which is organizing our entire transatlantic financial system. 1983 rolls around, and the former clerk of the Privy Council, Michael Pitfield, who is also known as Trudeau's shadow, the clerk of the Privy Council, by the way, is one of the most preeminent, powerful positions in the civil service. He is commissioned, now that he's a senator, to create CSIS, to take over the functions of the RCM, or that division of the RCMP, and CSIS is the outcome. This is the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. CSIS continues the worst traditions of the RCMP. And again, just doing a summary overview of some of the scandals that have arisen with CSIS since their creation. Officially it became in 1984. It's just mind-boggling. Really, you have... yeah, again, there's probably so much more that we have yet to discover, but just scratching the surface, we've pulled out the Air India bombing, which was famous for having been organized from a Sikh radical terrorist group that was being protected in Canada, had been maintained here for a very long time. EIR had conducted a lot of intelligence on this back in the time, since in 1984. It was the same grouping that organized the assassination of Indira Gandhi, a collaborator with Lyndon LaRouche and Helga LaRouche, and who was a big advocate of this new financial architecture and the new development bank that LaRouche had been pushing since the 1970s. So she was assassinated in 1984, and you had what's called the Air India bombing run out of Canada, which killed a couple hundred people. Why is this a scandal? CSIS didn't have to, and we don't even know who exactly put out the order. They didn't have to erase or burn all of the wiretaps, the hundreds of hours of wiretaps that were conducted leading up to that terrorist incident. They didn't have to do that, and yet they did that. Every single piece and shred of evidence that pertained to the Air India bombing was destroyed by CSIS. This remained a shadow above CSIS's head, and something that they could have been prosecuted for had somebody with balls been presented to actually do so. But in 2005, the 5-person Privy Council watchdog that governs, or that sort of takes care of monitoring CSIS, absolved them of their sins. This is the SIRC, so no longer could that be brought to any court. Hopefully, and their idea is hopefully people will forget about this. But again, just to relate this back to the present, right? What is the pedigree of this beast, and why should we be concerned about the official narrative being presented to us as being false, and the expanded powers that Harper is giving CSIS since 2012. Why should we be concerned about these things? Is this really for our security, or is there another agenda? And I think that by looking at what was done in the 1970s with the control of terrorist operations then, what was done by the protection of these radical terrorist groups with the Air India bombing, or even something, you know, I could throw this out too, I stumbled across this, the creation of, or the CSIS's role in actually helping to create the Heritage Front. I don't know if you've heard about the Heritage Front. This is the one of the biggest white supremacist groups in North America. That, you know, as the apocryphal story goes, a great hero, an agent within CSIS, Grant Brismus, championed for having the courage to go and infiltrate this very crazy white supremacist group. What a laudable act that is. And indeed it's true, from 1988 to 1994, this CSIS agent had infiltrated this grouping. What they don't mention, though, and this, you know, you have to dig a little deeper, what they tend to always leave out as a very important piece of information is that Mr. Brismus didn't just infiltrate this group. He actually co-founded the group. He co-founded the group in 1988 and maintained taxpayer money through CSIS that he maintained flowing into that group to help it expand, recruit, and grow its capabilities all the way, as far as it's known, till 1994. Beyond that, I'm not too sure. I wouldn't be surprised if more information were to surface that would prove that it's still going on. I don't know. But that's known. So we continue on, and, you know, this is the type of characteristic that we're dealing with this intelligence apparatus in our own backyard. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah.